Rio wakes up and finds himself in a realm of clouds with an angel standing in front of him. First of all, the angel informs him that he recently died, but he also says that Rio won't be going to the afterlife. Long story short, that damn truck got another one, so now Michael has to send Rio to another world so he can start a new life. From the information Michael has, Rio isn't going to receive any special mission or task to accomplish in the new world, so he is free to do whatever he wants. Rio says he would like to live a slow and relaxing life, and Michael is fine with that, but first he needs to give Rio a basic rundown of the world he will be reincarnating into. It is a magical world called Phi, and roughly 20% of the population can cast spells with their natural elements. With that said, the element Rio is most compatible with is water, and since he requested a slow, relaxing life, Michael took the liberty of setting up a small house with a starter pack and a barrier around it to keep monsters away. As a part of his starter pack, Michael has also prepared an ice house with 2 months worth of food in storage, so Rio won't have to worry about going hungry for a while. He also bought a book with detailed descriptions of all the monsters Rio might encounter in the area. This is going to be helpful when Rio eventually encounters the beasts of the forest, but for now, he wants to try out his new magic. He heads outside and yells out the incantation water ball, causing a sphere of water to appear in his hand, so magic seems a lot easier than he expected it to be. But he can also do it by just thinking of a water ball, so the incantation isn't really necessary. Now that he knows he can use magic, he heads straight for the bathhouse and starts filling the tub with water, but he soon realizes that he only knows how to make warm water. There's no way he can enjoy a bath that isn't hot, so he heads outside and immediately starts working on a fire to heat up the water. But unfortunately, he has no idea how to start a fire like this. He eventually gives up and lays down on his back, but then he looks up at the sun, and it gives him a good idea. Rio grabs a basin and fills it with water, then he tries focusing on it to compress the water while removing the heat. Eventually, ice begins to form, and after a little more practice, he is able to shake the ice into a magnifying glass so he can use the sun to start a fire. He then uses that fire to heat up a nice bath, so by the end of day 1, he can finally relax. With what he learned from creating the ice, he should be able to create hot water on his own if he just adds heat to the water instead, so he will have to start practicing that soon. The next morning, Rio is having breakfast when he starts thinking about his future. Michael only gave him 2 months worth of food, so he's going to have to go hunting eventually to replenish his stock. However, he's pretty sure a single knife won't be enough to handle the monsters out in the forest, so he decides to start training his offensive magic. The first thing he does is try shooting a water ball at a tree, and it works just as he had expected it to, but a little ball of water probably isn't going to be very helpful in combat. However, he knows of a way to make the water's impact stronger, so he forms another water ball, but this time, he concentrates all the water into a single point for extra pressure. It's a great idea in theory, but he still isn't skilled enough to put much force behind it, so his water jet is the equivalent of a squirt gun right now. Rio thinks back to something Michael told him before he reincarnated. Magic is all about imagination, so he needs to have a clear picture of what he's trying and continue working towards it until he gets better. After a few days of constant practice, Rio's water jets are starting to look decent, but it's still nowhere near strong enough to kill a monster yet. Additionally, Rio has also managed to get the hang of creating hot water, so he can now make warm baths for himself when he wants, although he still needs to work on temperature control. The next morning, he wants to start working on his ice magic again, so he heads out and tries creating ice out of thin air this time. It takes a lot of effort, but he is eventually able to summon ice from nothing, even if it took 3 to 4 business days for it to form, and he isn't able to shoot it as easily as water. So far, combat training hasn't been going very well since none of the spells he came up with have been effective, but over the next few hours, Rio keeps practicing as much as he can until he eventually collapses to the floor from mana exhaustion. He decides to call it a day for now, but the next morning, as soon as his mana has recovered, he begins practicing again. This becomes Rio's daily routine for the next few weeks, and after all his training, he is now able to form ice instantly, so it is a viable attack now. With his new arsenal of attack spells finally complete and his food supply running low, Rio heads out into the forest for the first time to begin his hunt. He immediately spots a pair of animal footprints, so he follows them until he eventually arrives at a nearby river. While he's there, he manages to find some flint by the riverside, and he can use it to start fires by striking it against the edge of his sword. While he's here, he also plans to gather some detoxification herbs in case he ever needs them, and all of a sudden, he hears a low-pitched growling sound coming from behind him. When he turns around, he finds a lesser boar staring him down, and he is completely frozen. The boar starts charging at Rio, but this is the first time he has ever had to fight for his life, so he's having trouble thinking of what to do. Just as the boar is about to hit him, he manages to snap out of it and jumps to the side to avoid getting trampled. But it doesn't look like the boar is done with him yet. Fortunately, Ryo has finally regained his composure, so as the boar is running at him, he creates an ice track to make it slip, and then he forms several ice spikes right in the path of the boar, leading to its immediate and brutal death. After processing the boar meat, Ryo takes a look at the monster book to read about it, and apparently the lesser boar is the weakest monster you can encounter in that forest. The whole book is meant to be a guide for beginners, so most of the monsters in it are pretty basic, but there are 2 extra pages at the end of the book which seem important. One page talks about dragons and how they are creatures powerful enough to destroy entire cities on their own. The book recommends running away immediately if he ever encounters one because he'd stand no chance of defeating it, although he probably wouldn't be able to outrun it either, so he'd be better off begging for mercy. There's also a page here talking about something called a demon, but there's not a lot of information on it, so all the book says is that if you ever run into one, you're doomed. The next day, Ryo goes out hunting again, but while he wasn't paying attention, he is suddenly attacked from above by a giant assassin hawk. The hawk is able to use wind magic to slash through its prey, so Ryo is forced to run while creating ice shields to block the razor wind. He knows how tough hawks are to deal with, so he would rather not fight it, but there's no way he will be able to outrun it, so his only option right now is to fight back. He raises his hand and begins casting his water jets, but the hawk manages to dodge his attack and swoops down with wind magic to strike Ryo. However, Ryo reacts in time to create an ice shield, slashing the hawk across the eye and causing it to slam headfirst into the ground. A few moments later, the hawk regains consciousness, although its eye has been permanently damaged, so it flies into the air to retreat. But before it leaves, it takes one final look at Ryo to memorize his face, because now the hawk has a personal beef with him. Ryo is relieved that he managed to survive, but this really isn't what he was expecting his new relaxing life to become. While Ryo was being chased by the hawk, he ran so far that he ended up getting lost in the forest until late into the night, and while he was trying to find his way back home, he happens to come across a glowing lake with a Dullahan standing in the middle, and it looks like it has spotted him. As time goes on, Ryo continues his training, and now he is able to hunt and preserve food for himself with relative ease. His water magic has also gotten a lot stronger, allowing him to create sharp ice sheets and bring them down with great force in an instant. His water jet has also become strong enough to cut through solid rock with ease, so his compatibility is pretty good now. But ice magic isn't the only training he has been doing lately. Ever since that day he was spotted by the Dullahan, he has gone out into the forest late every night to fight it. Headless horsemen weren't mentioned in the monster guidebook at all, so it is either not a monster or it's simply too advanced for the beginner guidebook. Either way, Ryo still plans to fight it, so he charges forward with his ice stick and begins swinging. This is more of a training session than an actual fight because the Dullahan outclasses Ryo in both strength and skill, but Ryo is still doing his best to block the Dullahan's attacks with his ice shields, but he still ends up getting taken down in a matter of seconds. The Dullahan has never said a word to Ryo, but for some reason, Ryo feels like he has taken on the role of a teacher trying to whip him into shape. Just then, the Dullahan raises its sword and uses water magic to extend its blade. Ryo is surprised to learn that the Dullahan can use water magic as well, but after demonstrating how the sword works, it hands it over to Ryo and walks out onto the lake. Sometime later, Ryo was out hunting as usual when he was suddenly attacked by the same assassin hawk from last time. He doesn't recall it being black last time he saw it, so he assumes it must have worked hard to evolve just so it could come back for a rematch. The hawk dives toward Ryo and launches several wind slashes, so Ryo puts up 5 layers of ice walls to protect himself. However, since it has evolved, Hawk's wind slashes are so strong that they instantly shattered all of Ryo's ice walls. And now he's starting to get really nervous. He starts darting across the field while putting up ice walls to block any incoming attacks, and when he finally sees an opening, he counterattacks by launching several ice spikes. However, the hawk managed to dodge the spikes with a sudden burst of speed, and that's not all either. It opens its mouth and screeches at a frequency that interferes with Ryo's magic, so all his ice shields disappear, and he is practically defenseless. But the hawk still isn't done yet, so it begins hovering in front of Ryo, and he can tell that something big is coming, but he doesn't know when it is. Moments later, Ryo can feel electricity in the air as a bolt of lightning is shot straight at him, and an attack like that would have been fatal, but luckily he was able to use a stick as a lightning rod and jump away to save himself. While Ryo is recovering from the partial shock he just received, the hawk comes down and tries to finish him off with its talons, but at the last second, Ryo pulls out his ice sword and parries the attack. The hawk clashes with him a few more times, but thanks to all Ryo's training with Dullahan, he is able to quickly locate a gap in the hawk's defenses and stab it through the neck. After the hawk falls to the ground, Ryo approaches it because he can understand how it feels. It lost an eye because of Ryo, so it desperately wanted to prove that it was stronger than him, which is why it evolved in the first place. But Rio has also spent his time trying to get strong, so in the end, the Hawks still lost. After that, Rio begins walking home, but to his utter shock, he is suddenly confronted by a dragon. He remembers what the book said about dragons being unstoppable, so he believes he is doomed, but to his surprise, the dragon begins talking to him using telepathy. The dragon doesn't seem like it wants to hurt Rio in any way. In fact, it just stuck here because it is currently looking for a black hawk that came this way, so it was wondering if Rio might have seen it around here. Rio is glad that the dragon isn't hostile, but it is probably talking about the hawk he just killed, so he apologizes profusely and explains that the hawk attacked him, so he had no choice but to kill it. The dragon is surprised to hear that a human like Rio could kill a hawk, but he doesn't seem too upset about it. On another note, the dragon is rather intrigued by the sword Rio is carrying because he recognizes it as the Fairy King's. And for him to have given it away to a young boy, Rio must have done something to get on his good side. The dragon has taken a liking to Rio, and Rio has a few questions he was hoping to ask since he still doesn't have much information about this world. He and the dragon end up talking for a few hours until it is late into the evening, but their conversation is cut short because the dragon needs to return home now. Rio thanks him for answering his questions, and the dragon thanks him as well because it has been ages since he got to have such an interesting conversation. The two of them say their goodbyes, but while that is happening, Michael is up in heaven reviewing the paperwork for Rio's reincarnation when he notices something he missed earlier. It looks like Rio was given the hidden trait of eternal youth for some reason, and Michael thinks it's strange because he hasn't seen someone with a hidden trait since he sent a hero girl to Fae 10,000 years ago. One day, Rio heads down to the beach because he has been craving salt recently. But when he gets there, he finds the wreckage of a washed-up ship. He approaches the ship to see if there are any survivors, and he finds a body lying next to it, but when he checks on the guy, he realizes the man is already dead, so there's nothing he can do to help. However, just then, Rio hears the sound of someone grunting on the other side of the beach, so he looks over there, and he is pleased to see that someone actually survived the wreckage. The ship was destroyed by a giant sea monster during a massive storm, so Abel was certain he would meet his end at sea, but to his surprise, he wakes up in a warm bed. All of his stuff has been set aside on the table next to him, so he grabs it and starts exploring the area because he has no idea where he is. He heads outside in hopes of spotting a landmark or something, but all he can see around the house is a thick tree line. Just then, Rio comes out of the house and he says he's glad to see that Abel is back on his feet. Abel is shocked when he realizes Rio is here because he couldn't sense him approaching him at all, but aside from that, he thinks Rio is dressed really weird. He's about to ask why Rio has no sense of style, but then he realizes that it would be rude to say something like that right off the bat, so instead, he first thanks Rio for saving his life. Rio says there's no need to thank him since all he did was carry Abel's body here, but unfortunately, Abel was the only one left alive by the time Rio found them, so the rest of the people aboard the ship are long dead. Abel is a bit surprised that other people washed up alongside him, but he tells Rio that he doesn't have time to worry about their deaths too much because everyone else on that ship was an illegal smuggler. Rio isn't exactly sure what Abel means by smugglers, but for now, Abel must be pretty hungry after surviving a wreck like that, so Rio offers to make some lunch for him. While they are eating, Abel eventually asks Rio why he's wearing nothing but a loincloth, so Rio explains that he doesn't have any clothes to wear. Abel asks why Rio doesn't just go out and buy some clothes, but then he stops himself because he thinks Rio may not have enough money to buy necessities for himself, and it would be rude to bring that up now. Rio is indeed broke AF right now, but even if he had money to spend, he wouldn't be able to buy anything because there are no towns or villages anywhere near his house. Abel is shocked to hear that, but for someone living out here on their own, Abel is impressed by how well Rio is doing for himself. He asked Rio if he used that knife on the table to hunt for the meat they are eating right now, but Rio says the knife is mainly for butchering his catches. When he goes out hunting, he usually just uses his water magic, and as proof of his ability, he creates a little water to fill a jug. Abel is amazed because even on the Central Plains, only about half of the people there can use magic. Rio, on the other hand, is shocked to learn that magic is so common since Michael told him that only 20% of the population can wield magic. After lunch, Abel asks Rio to lead him back to the shipwreck because there's something there that he needs to check. Rio agrees to lead Abel back to the coast, and while the two of them are walking, Abel asks Rio why he doesn't use a magic staff even though he's a magician. Rio is a little confused since he has never needed a staff, but Abel then realizes that if Rio can't buy clothes, then of course he wouldn't be able to buy a staff either. To make up for his rudeness, Abel asks Rio to let him handle all the fighting if they run into any trouble along the way. Rio tries telling him that that won't be necessary since he can already handle all the threats in the forest on his own, but Abel insists since he wants to contribute somehow. The two of them eventually arrive at the wreckage, but to Rio's surprise, all the bodies have disappeared. He thinks a monster must have shown up and eaten the bodies at some point, so Abel was really lucky that Rio found him before anything bad had happened. After searching the wreckage for a while, Abel realizes that what he's looking for isn't here, so he stops looking. Rio asks him what he plans to do now, so Abel says he's going to regroup with his friends, although that's a lot easier said than done. Heading to the town of Loon would be a good start towards getting him back to his friends, but he's pretty sure that this place is way down south of Loon, and he has no idea how long it will take for him to get back. He fears he may have to brace himself for a long and lonely journey, but then he comes up with an idea and asks Rio if he'd like to come with him. Rio is a little stunned by the offer, but Abel says he's not familiar with this area at all, so he can really use a guide to help lead him back. Rio thinks about it for a second, and there really isn't much reason for him to stay here at this point. He's also curious to learn about what the other people of this world are like, so he agrees to accompany Abel. However, he has a few things he needs to take care of first, so he asks if it's okay for them to leave tomorrow morning. Abel has no objections, so they head back to Rio's house for now, and later that night, Rio prepares to head out into the forest alone. Abel thinks it's odd that Rio would want to go out to see someone at this time of night, especially since he said there were no other people in this area, but he also doesn't want to pry into Rio's personal business too much, so he doesn't say anything. Rio heads into the forest and eventually meets with Dullahan. He informs them that he will be leaving the forest for some time, and this may be the last time they get to spar together for a while, so he plans to fight as hard as he can. Rio readies his sword and charges at Dullahan, and Dullahan is still able to block all of Rio's attacks, but with how much Rio has improved, his attacks are strong enough to actually push Dullahan back for a change. However, Dullahan's skill is still far greater than that of Rio's, so after a long battle, Rio falls to his knees in defeat. Now that their match is over, Dullahan slowly starts walking back out onto the lake, so Rio gets up and thanks it for all the training it has given him. It's all thanks to Dullahan's help that Rio has been able to survive in this forest for so long, and Dullahan has come to think of Rio as his precious student, so as a parting gift, it presents Rio with a special robe, and Rio is really grateful. The next morning, Rio and Abel are finally ready to leave on their journey, and as they walk away, Rio says one final goodbye to his first home in this world. As the two make their way deeper into the forest, they soon encounter a boar monster, so Abel asks Rio to stand back and let him handle it. He draws his sword and charges at the boar while calling out a combat skill called Total Impalement, and in an instant, a hole is blown clean through the boar's body. Rio is amazed by what he just saw, so he asks Abel what combat skills are, and Abel explains that those who can't use magic fight with techniques called combat skills, which allow them to do incredible things like what Abel just did to that boar. After a day of walking through the forest, they eventually arrive at a marsh area, but it's full of lizardmen and Abel would like to avoid fighting them all together, so he suggests that he and Rio should circle around through the woods. However, while they are taking the detour, Rio senses something slowly creeping up on them, so he has Abel's attention and informs him that the lizardmen are following them. Abel says they are going to have to fight them off, so he readies his sword, but Rio tells him there are too many lizardmen for Abel to fight on his own, so he's going to deal with them using magic. Abel doesn't understand how Rio intends to defeat a group of lizardmen on his own, but as the lizards emerge from the tree line, Rio immediately shoots them down with several icicles. Abel is shocked by what he just witnessed, but they are still in the middle of a battle, so he's going to have to save his questions for later. Once all the lizardmen have been dealt with, Abel asks Rio to explain what kind of spell he just used. Rio doesn't understand what Abel is talking about since all he did was cast several ordinary icicle spells, but from what Abel has been told, a mage should only be able to cast one spell at a time. Abel got the information from a wind mage, so Rio thinks the limit of one spell at a time must be unique to wind magic because he has never had any trouble multicasting with water before. Anyway, before they continue, Rio creates a glass of water for Abel since they need to stay hydrated, but Abel notices that the incantation Rio used this time is different from the one he used to create water before, so he's curious. Rio doesn't actually need to use incantations at all, he just thinks they sound really cool, but he doesn't want Abel to think he's weird, so he pretends nothing changed. They eventually make it out of the forest and into an open field, but without realizing it, they had accidentally wandered into a rock golem field, so Abel and Rio have to block the rocks being thrown at them. This is the first time Rio has ever seen rock golems, and he is surprised because they look nothing like what he had expected. Abel runs ahead and tries using his Total Impalement skill on the golems, but even though he managed to carve a hole through one of them, the golem seals itself back up in an instant, so he won't be able to make much progress like this. Since the golems are able to heal, Rio thinks they need to destroy them in one attack, and he has the perfect spell in mind for the job. He asks Abel to give him some space because he has something he wants to try, and once Abel is out of the danger zone, Rio uses his magic to summon an ice cube, a really big one. He then drops the cube on two of the golems, and even he is a little scared by how destructive that attack was. He does the same thing to the rest of the golems until there's only one left, but this one isn't moving anymore for some reason. Rio assumes the golems must have been absorbing energy from the ground to power their attacks, so now that this one has fallen over, it can't do much anymore. They also spot a massive magic stone at the bottom of the golem, so they plan to take it with them, but it's too bad that they can't get any more since all the other golems were crushed. The two of them set up camp for the night, and while they are talking, Abel mentions something about dungeons having monsters like golems. As soon as Rio hears the word dungeon, he becomes incredibly excited and asks why Abel didn't mention anything about dungeons earlier. Abel didn't think Rio would be so interested in the topic, but if he really wants to see a dungeon so badly, then he's in luck, because the only dungeon in the Central Plains is located in Lune, the town they are headed for. Rio asks if there's anything else he should know about, so Abel asks if he knows about the dwarves and elves. Rio has heard a little about them, but he wants some more details, so Abel explains that dwarves are strong, short people who are good with crafts, and there are quite a few of them in Lune. But as for elves, most of them live in wooded areas and don't interact with humans often, so Abel only knows of one elf in Lune. The next morning, the two continue heading north, and Rio says that once they make it past those mountains over there, they will find human civilization. Abel has been trying avoiding prying too much into Rio's personal matters, but he's really curious as to how on earth Rio knows where he's going when he has never actually been to a human village. The truth is, Rio got all this info from his conversation with the dragon, but he is pretty sure saying that would freak Abel out, so he tells him he's better off not knowing. A few moments later, Rio senses something terrifying nearby, and to both his and Abel's horror, they are confronted by a giant griffin. Neither of them has what it takes to defeat a monster like this, so Rio thinks quickly and reaches into his pouch, throwing the meat he saved for later into the air. Abel does the same, and the griffin immediately snatches it out of the air. It now has enough food for the day, so it decides to leave the two of them alone, and they are both incredibly relieved that they managed to survive. Abel says monsters like griffins haven't been seen near humans for centuries, so it is likely that this mountain is keeping a lot of the more powerful monsters away from civilization. But if that's the case, then they are bound to run into even more monsters here. And it looks like he was right, because not long after, they both encounter a group of wyverns. Abel thinks they should circle around to avoid fighting them, but that would take way too long on a mountain, and besides, while the griffin may have been too much for Rio to handle, he knows he's strong enough to beat the wyverns, so he runs out from cover and uses several icicle spears to bring the wyverns down. Abel is astonished by how easy that was, since wyverns usually require 20 adventurers to defeat, but as long as they made it out in one piece, he's not complaining. Rio and Abel continue fighting their way through the mountain after that, and eventually, they manage to make it to the other side, so they are one step closer to making it back to civilization. After a few days of fighting their way through the mountains, Abel and Rio finally make it out into the plains. Rio is a little disappointed since he was having so much fun slaying all those wyverns, but Abel doesn't understand how he could call that fun. However, he does admit that all the wyvern stones they collected are a nice bonus, so this trip was really productive. Abel eventually spots a road in the distance stretching from east to west and recognizes it as the one that leads to the town of Kailati, so if they go in that direction, they should arrive pretty soon. Rio is looking forward to seeing what the cities in this world look like, and since they'll be stopping in Kailati for a while, Abel suggests Rio should try the food there because it's really good. The two eventually arrive in Kailati, and the first thing they do is head to a restaurant. There, Abel tells Rio that he should probably register at the Adventurers Guild once they get to Lune, since it would act as an identification card for him. That way, he'd be able to travel to any city in the kingdom without Abel needing to vouch for him like he did for Rio to get into Kailati. Additionally, Rio would also be able to sell all the magic stones he collected at the guild, so it's the natural thing to do. Just then, their food arrives, and Rio is shocked when he sees what's in the plate in front of him, because it's curry. He never even considered that curry might exist in this world, and as someone who has been eating bland meat and vegetables since he got here, he is dying for some spice. The next day, Rio and Abel leave Kailati to continue their journey, and after a while, they finally arrive at the city of Lune. As they approach the gates, the guard posted out front recognizes Abel, and he is shocked to see him because he was declared missing months ago. Abel says it's a long story, but basically the only reason he made it back alive was thanks to Rio. Naimer enthusiastically shakes Rio's hand because he is grateful that he saved his friend. Naimer is still on guard duty, so he doesn't have time to catch up properly with Abel, but he does ask where Abel is headed. Abel says he's going to go to the guild first since everyone there is probably still worried about him, and while they are at it, he plans to get Rio registered as an adventurer. Normally, you'd start out as an F rank, but with an endorsement from a high-ranked adventurer like Abel, Rio should be able to start at D rank. Anyways, when your rank is high, you'll be allowed to take on quests with higher difficulty, and in turn, you'll get better rewards. But considering the number of Wyvern gems Rio got, Abel doubts he will need to worry about money for a while. Rio asks if Wyvern gems are really all that valuable, and according to Abel, they are so valuable that selling them all at once might cause the market to crash. So he's probably going to have to let the guild master figure out what they should do with them. Once they arrive, Abel walks in, and as soon as he is seen, everyone gathers around because they all thought he was dead. It's clear that Abel is really popular here, and Rio doesn't want to get in the way of Abel's reunion, so he decides to step out for a moment. He starts taking a walk through the city when all of a sudden, he bumps into an elf girl, and she happens to recognize his robe as one that can only be gotten from the King of Fairies. If Rio was given a robe, then the King of Fairies must have really taken a liking to him. She thinks Rio is interesting, so she'd like to talk to him, but she's got urgent matters to attend to, so she has to go. Rio is about to chase after her, but at that moment, Abel comes out looking for Rio because he wants to introduce him to all the people at the guild. Abel tells everyone that if it weren't for Rio, he never would have been able to return home. The guild patrons are all really thankful for Rio's help, so they give him a warm welcome, and Rio is starting to like it here. After Rio's introduction, Abel takes him to the front desk so he can get registered, and while he's there, he asks the receptionist, Nina, if it would be possible to raise Rio's rank to D with his endorsement. Nina is surprised to hear this since Abel has never endorsed someone before, but Rio is more than qualified. Nina says there should be no problem ranking Rio up, but they will still need to do a proof of strength test, so Abel plans to go talk to the guild master about it. Nina says the two of them can wait in the meeting room while she calls the guild master over, so Rio and Abel take a seat. As soon as the guild master is informed that Abel has returned, he rushes into the meeting room, and he is incredibly relieved to see that Abel is still alive and well. Abel apologizes for making the guild master worry so much about him, but Hugh is just glad to see him again. He then notices the young magician standing in the back, so Abel introduces Rio as the boy who saved his life. Anyway, Abel mentions that he was hoping to rank up Rio's registration with an endorsement, and Hugh is fine with that. But he's still going to need to confirm Rio's strength before he can authorize any upgrades. Abel tells him that won't be a problem because Rio is a lot stronger than he looks, and as proof, he shows him the bag full of wyvern stones. After inspecting the stones, Hugh confirms that they indeed belong to wyverns, but he is starting to get concerned because if there are this many wyverns in the area, they could overrun the country in an instant. Abel assures him that he doesn't need to worry about that since the wyverns they encountered were south of the Malefic Mountains, so they won't be coming here anytime soon. Rio is baffled by the mention of the Malefic Mountains because he has never heard of that place before, but Abel explains that those were the mountains they passed through to get here. The Malefic Mountains are so dangerous that even high-rank adventurers don't go anywhere near it, so the fact that Rio and Abel made it through these mountains alive is an amazing feat on its own. Abel asks if this will be enough to prove that Rio is strong, and Hugh agrees that Rio is definitely qualified for the rank up. Just then, the members of Abel's party show up because they heard the news that Abel was alive and well, so they had to come see him in person. Abel apologizes to his teammates for making them worry, and they probably got a lot of catching up to do, so Hugh says he will let them use the meeting room while he gets started on the paperwork for Rio's rank up. Hugh leaves Rio into another room, and Mina later comes in with the items for Rio's guild registration. First, they need to fill out his form, so Nina asks him a few questions about his class, and Rio answers that he's a water magician. He has also never been in a dungeon before, so Nina suggests he should take part in the dungeon training course that's held every month. Rio seems really excited about getting to see a dungeon in person, so he agrees to sign up for the training course. Nina tells him the course starts in 2 days at 9 o'clock, and Rio is surprised. He wasn't expecting the people of this world to use the same units of time he's familiar with. Moving on, Nina asks Rio to place his hand on this crystal to complete his registration, and when he does, all of his information is filled out onto a guild card. This guild card will be Rio's ID from now on, and now that he's officially registered, he heads outside to meet Abel. He asks what Abel wants to do now, and he says he intends to buy Rio some new clothes and a staff as a way of showing his appreciation, and Rio appreciates the gesture, but he has never really needed a staff. Most mages require staves to use their magic, but for Rio, he's perfectly capable of casting magic without one. Besides, he uses a sword for close combat anyway, so his staff would only get in the way. More importantly, Rio has a couple of questions he'd like to ask Abel. They spend a few hours talking, and Rio finds out that this world uses a 24-hour day system just like Earth with 7 days a week and 30 days a month. It also uses the metric system for measurements, so Ryo assumes someone must have been reincarnated here before him and had a huge impact on the way the world works now. It's getting pretty late now, so Abel thinks it's about time he heads back to the guild, and as the guest of honor, he says Ryo has to come too. Ryo doesn't know what he means by that at first, but when they return to the guild, he realizes that a party has been organized for him and Abel. Everyone is in a good mood, so the party is really lively. Almost a little too lively, in fact, because by the next morning, Ryo is absolutely exhausted. Nina apologizes on behalf of everyone for tiring Ryo out so much, but he says it's fine since it's partially his fault for drinking so much anyway. Ryo will be staying in the guild's lodging for the time being, so Nina leads him to his room and introduces his new roommates. This one is Nils, while the blonde one in the back is named Ito, and they are both pleased to meet Ryo. Since everyone seems to be getting along, Nina tells Ryo that she needs to get back to the reception desk, so she'll be leaving now. But before she goes, she reminds him that the dungeon tutorial class is tomorrow, so he had better not be late. Once Nina is gone, Nils starts talking about how hot he thinks she is, but Ito tells him to give it a rest already because there's no way Nina would go out with a bum like him. Moving on, Ito greets Ryo and says he'd like to keep things casual here so they can become friends. Ryo says he'd like to be friends as well, and Ito is glad to hear it because he was worried Ryo might be a stuck-up jerk like Dan from room 1. A moment later, there's a knock at the door, and it turns out to be Nina again. She apologizes for the interruption, but she just got a newly registered adventurer in need of lodging, so she wants to set him up in this room as well. He says his name is Amon, but the others are surprised that he's an adventurer since there's no way he's old enough yet. Amon admits that he's still only 16, but both his parents are dead, so he didn't have many options to make a living. Ito tells Amon that it's nothing to be ashamed of since that's how most people end up becoming adventurers in the first place, and apparently, Amon plans on taking the dungeon course tomorrow as well, so Nina asks Ryo to go with him. While Ryo is getting acquainted with his new roommates, Abel is telling his party members all about what happened while he was crossing the Malefic Mountains, but the mage, Lin, simply refuses to believe that a boy like Ryo is capable of such strong magic. Sure, ice walls can be made with magic, but they are usually so thin that they can't block any damage, and something like conjuring a giant ice cube to drop on your enemy is simply impossible. Abel asserts that he saw Ryo do it with his own eyes, but Lin still can't accept it. Power like that goes against all the fundamentals of magic that she spent her life studying, and she's getting angrier by the second at the thought that a kid is way more powerful than she is. But Abel is still confident that he knows what he saw. From what Abel has described, the only other person with similar abilities they can think of would be the famous Inferno Magician. The Inferno Magician is a legendary hero capable of wiping out thousands of Imperial soldiers with a single chant and burning wyverns to ash in an instant. It feels absurd to compare Ryo to someone who is so renowned, but if his power truly is on the level of the Inferno Mage, then Raiha is worried about what might happen if Ryo were to turn against them and join the Empire. However, Abel is certain that that will never happen because Ryo doesn't think the Empire of Debui sounds cool, and that's what he cares about the most. A few days go by and Ryo has been diligently attending the dungeon training course, but for today's lesson, the instructor tells everyone that they'll be heading into an actual dungeon for the first time. He asks if anyone has any questions for him regarding the dungeons, so Ryo raises his hand and asks if there are any teleportation mechanisms that allow you to travel to floors that you've previously cleared. The instructor is impressed that Ryo was actually aware of that, but while things of that nature do exist in the southern dungeon, he tells Ryo that he won't find any around here. A little while later, everyone arrives at the dungeon entrance, and the instructor explains that the city of Loon was actually built around the dungeon, so it is pretty much right in the center. Every couple of years, something called the tidal bore happens, meaning the monster population inside the dungeon rapidly rises, and such an event puts the people in the town at risk of being attacked, so these double walls were built to keep the monsters contained. Ryo thinks it's interesting that Loon has an outer wall and an inner wall as well, but Amon is just worried because the tidal bore event seems really scary. The instructor assures him that there's nothing to worry about since the tidal bore only happens once every few years, so the chances of one happening right now are insanely slim. The group soon arrives on the first floor of the dungeon, and the instructor tells them that there are only basic monsters on this level, so everyone is free to explore as much as they'd like, but they should still stay close by in case of an emergency. Ryo and Amon go off on their own to search the area, and a little while later, Ryo senses a monster up ahead, so he tells Amon they'll deal with it together. As they advance through the cave, they eventually spot the monster, and this one is just a regular soldier ant, so Ryo tells Amon that he's going to pin it to the ground, and when he does, he wants Amon to finish it off. Amon says he understands the plan, so Ryo casts ice magic to pierce the ant's limbs, and while it is immobile, Amon runs up to it and slices its head off. Rio congratulates him on his first successful monster kill, and Amon feels really good about himself, but there's still more to be done since they need to harvest the magic stone from the Ent's corpse before they return. Later that night, Rio and Amon get back to the guild lodge, and when the other two hear that they successfully completed the course, they hold a celebration for them. Ito is honestly impressed because he didn't expect Rio and Amon to be able to defeat a soldier ant on their first trip into the dungeon, but Amon says he didn't really do much. It was Rio who held the monster down for him, but Rio says Amon deserves at least a bit of credit because he was the one who dealt the finishing blow. Nils asks the two of them what they plan to do now that they are dungeon certified, and Amon says he'd like to go back to the dungeon and continue exploring, but the thought of going in alone terrifies him, so he's not sure what to do. Rio says he'd be happy to go in with Amon if he's looking for a partner, since he was planning to go down to the third floor of the dungeon anyway. Something about that ant being on the first floor has Rio curious, because from what the instructor said, only bats should have been on that floor. Just then, Ebel shows up behind Rio and tells him that ants sometimes dug tunnels up to the first floor, so it's not impossible to see one up there. Rio was a little surprised because he wasn't expecting to see Ebel today, but Nils and Ito, on the other hand, are completely starstruck because Abel is really famous around here. Nils is especially nervous because he says Abel has always been his hero, so he introduces himself and asks to shake his hand. Abel is always happy to meet the new adventurers, so he agrees to shake his hand and gives him a friendly reminder not to overdo it when he's out on quests, because survival should be his top priority. Rio asks Abel what he's doing here at this time of night, so he explains that he and his party actually just got back from a particularly long quest, so they are here to debrief the guild master on what happened. Speaking of his party, they walk in looking for him, and they are getting sick of Abel sneaking off whenever they have meetings to get to. So Warren throws him over his shoulder and carries Abel out of the room. Rio finds the whole thing amusing, but then he notices Lynn staring at him like she's got a bone to pick even though he barely knows her. Ria tells Lynn to stop being creepy and hurry up since they still need to go talk to the guild master, and she then apologizes to Rio for interrupting his conversation, but Rio says he doesn't really mind. On their way out, Ria scolds Lynn because it's rude to stare at people like that, but Lynn couldn't help herself because there's no way she wouldn't be curious about Rio after learning that he's supposedly an incredible mage. To be honest, Ria is also interested in seeing what Rio can do, but Abel tells them there's no need to rush because sooner or later, they'll get a chance to witness Rio in battle. The next day, Rio and Amon head down into the dungeon again, and they agree to use the same strategy as the day before, so Rio uses his ice magic to incapacitate the monsters and Amon finishes them off with his sword. While they are taking a break, Rio asks Amon where he learned to fight because his style reminds him of the one Abel fights with. Amon explains that he was taught by an old man named Kiro, and Kiro apparently studied the sword from one of the famous sword schools in the royal capital, Hume. So that's most likely what Amon's style is based on. Rio thinks it's neat and efficient, but you notice that Amon gets tired out a lot when he uses it, so he might need to work on his stamina a little more. Amon gets a little upset because he thinks he's not good enough to become a proper adventurer with how weak he is, but Rio assures him that he just needs to keep training to get better. Even for someone as strong as Abel, he always made sure to keep up with his daily training, no matter what, when he was traveling with Rio, which goes to show how much of an effect consistent practice can have on your abilities. Early the next day, Rio prepares to head out again, but this time he's not heading into the dungeon because he has other plans. He's been meaning to learn about alchemy, so he heads to the library to see what he can find. Once he gets there, he asks the librarian for help finding the alchemy section, and he is amazed by the sheer volume of books in this place. The librarian eventually leads Rio to the beginner alchemy section, and he spends the next few hours studying as much as he can, but there's only so much you can do, you're on a time limit, so he starts considering buying the books outright so he can just study at home. While sitting on one of the benches in town square, Rio soon realizes that the sky is going dark, so he looks up and is shocked to see the sun being blocked out all of a sudden. In the next moment, all the people around him vanish and he can feel it instinctual. You cannot rest with monsters nearby feeling, so he's on high alert. A second later, a massive fire blast is sent straight at Rio, so he uses several ice shields to block it. He thankfully managed to survive the blaze, but it did a number on his shield, and he is terrified as he sees a hot demon woman slowly walking towards him. Just by looking at her, Rio can tell that Leonor is a terrifying opponent, so his first instinct is to run away as fast as he can, but he doubts he will be able to escape since this space seems to be some kind of pocket dimension. Leonor sends another blast his way and Rio is able to block it with his ice walls, but then she uses wind magic to send a pointed blast at Rio's heart. Rio wasn't expecting that, so he wasn't able to react in time, but fortunately, his robe seems to have dispelled the wind lance before it did any damage to him. Leonor recognizes those robes as one from the Fairy King, and she wonders what human boy could have done to earn the Fairy King's favor, but it's not like it matters much anyway. Since wind and fire magic haven't worked against Rio so far, she decides to do things the old-fashioned way and takes out her sword so she can cut Rio down. Rio draws his sword as well to counter her, and they both seem to be evenly matched when it comes to sword speed, but Rio thinks he can outlast her since the Fairy King's training was much harder than this. Leonor tries using her magic to give herself the edge, but Rio's casting speed is much quicker than hers, so he cancels out her spell before she's even done with it. The two clash again, and once Rio spots an opening, he unleashes a barrage of icicles in an attempt to incapacitate Leonor. However, she uses fire to melt most of the ice, and then creates two large rock walls to block out the rest. Unfortunately for her, the rocks weren't strong enough to stop Rio's pressurized water jets, so she gets caught off guard and is sliced up a little. Rio takes the opportunity to rush in for a finishing blow, but when he clashes swords with her, he notices that her wounds are healing, so she must have a healing factor, and minor scratches like that probably won't be enough to slow her down. Leonor pushes Rio back and slams him into a building, but in the next moment she finds herself surrounded by dozens of water bubbles, and as soon as they come into contact with her skin, the bubbles instantly vaporize, boiling Leonor's skin right off her face. She buries herself in rocks to hide from the boiling water, and once she has recovered, she is ecstatic because that was the first time a human has ever made her feel real pain, and she kinda liked it. She would love to keep fighting with Rio, but unfortunately, the cloister zone is about to expire, so her time is up. She is disappointed that she didn't get to kill him, but given how strong Rio is, she is sure they'll end up facing each other on the battlefield again, one way or another. With that, the cloister is dispelled and Leonor disappears, so Rio is incredibly relieved. He realizes he really needs to step up his game because if it weren't for this magic robe, he would have a hole in his chest right now. But since he won't have to deal with Leonor again for a while, he decides to go buy those books he was thinking about before she showed up. Rio heads to the guild to check his account balance, and to his shock, he's loaded. He remembers Abel telling him that those wyvern stones were really valuable, but he didn't think selling just one of those stones would earn him so much money. It looks like he won't have to worry about earning money for a while, so he decides to head back to his room for the day, but he's surprised to see that none of the others are back yet. He then hears a commotion out in the backyard, so he goes to check it out and sees Nils, Ito, and Amon beaten up on the ground while surrounded by 5 guys. Nils curses Dan for ambushing them like this, but Dan mockingly tells him an adventurer must always be alert, so it's Nils' own fault that he got caught lacking. By the way, Dan has no reason to be doing this, he's just being a jerk for the love of the game. But Rio doesn't appreciate him messing with his friends like that, so with no warning, he uses his ice magic to knock out 4 of the guys standing there, leaving Dan all alone. He asks Dan if he's going to run away now that he has no backup, but Dan assumes Rio must suck at hand-to-hand combat since he's a mage, so he throws a haymaker, and Rio promptly makes him throw up his lunch as well. Now that Dan has been taken care of, Rio goes over to his friends and offers Ito a recovery potion so he can use his healing magic on the others. Even though he got jumped, Nils feels terrible about letting himself get beaten by Dan, but Rio tells him it's not his fault since he must have been exhausted from doing dungeon runs with Amon all day. Anyway, since he's just as exhausted as they are, Rio suggests they all take a nice dip in a hot bath to relax, and while they are in there, Ito uses his healing magic to heal Rio's wound. Luckily, there were no broken bones, but he can tell that the attack had a lot of force behind it, so it would have been bad news if it had hit his heart. Rio tells him the attack actually was aimed at his heart, but he just barely managed to dodge enough to redirect it to his shoulder. Although it still really hurt. The others are shocked when they hear that Rio was nearly beaten when they know how strong he is, so they ask him what he could possibly have been fighting. Rio says it's a long story, so he will tell them later, but as for right now, he just wants to relax. The next day, Ito, Amon, and Nils head back into the dungeon, and after taking out a goblin archer on the 5th floor, Nils suggests they should head home for the day. It hasn't been long since they got here, but goblin archers aren't supposed to show up on the 5th floor, so he has a bad feeling about this. Besides, they already made more than enough money for today, so he doesn't want to take any unnecessary risks. And it's a good thing they decided to turn back here, because further down the cave, there was a monster which would have absolutely destroyed them if they ran into it, especially since Rio isn't here. Speaking of Rio, he is currently outside the city because his battle against Leonor made him realize how much he needs to improve. In terms of casting speed, they were both evenly matched, but Leonor was able to move a lot faster than him thanks to her wind magic, so he needs to work on his movement speed. However, Rio isn't able to use wind magic, so he is going to need to come up with an alternative. The best spell he can think of to act as propulsion is his water jet, since he uses it for improved mobility underwater, but he has never used it to move on land before, so he's not sure how to go about it. For starters, he forms some ice on the ground, and then he generates several water jets along his back, but it barely moves his body, so his first test ends in failure. He decides to try it with more water jets next time, but for now, he wants to head back to the library so he can learn more about alchemy and demons. Meanwhile, Lin is busy searching through all the spellbooks she can find because she's looking for anything similar to that giant ice cube spell Abel said he saw Rio use, but even the forbidden spell books don't mention it. If Rio actually pulled it off, then it would have to have been an original spell, but a spell like that would require an incredible amount of mana, so she still finds it hard to believe that Rio was able to do it so casually. Just as she is putting the book back, the elf girl from earlier, Sarah, walks in and she seems to be good friends with Lin, so she asks what she's doing here. Lin explains that she was just trying to locate a spell in one of the spellbooks, but she couldn't find what she was looking for. Sarah says she's sorry to hear that and she'd love to help Lin search, but she just got back from a mission to the royal capital, and she's late for an important meeting. Back at the guild, the boys head over to the front desk to give Nina a report on their dungeon exploration today. Nina is surprised to see them back so soon since they usually spend a lot more time in the dungeon, but Ito tells her there's actually a reason they came back early. He shows her the magic stone they got, and after inspecting it, Nina confirms that it really does belong to a goblin archer. A goblin archer showing up on the 5th floor is practically unheard of, so she rushes off to inform the guild master, but before she goes, she thanks the boys for the valuable intel. Once the guild master hears the news, he is just as shocked as Nina was because goblin archers aren't meant to show up until the 10th floor, so encountering one on the 5th floor means something is terribly wrong. The guild master asks Nina how many high-ranking parties are still in Loon at the moment, and right now, the only ones available are Abel's party, Crimson Sword, and a White Brigade party, so the guild master asks Nina to call them here so he can deliver the news in person. A little while later, Abel and the others arrive at the guild in response to the guild master's summons, but Abel isn't exactly thrilled because he heard White Brigade is going to be here as well, and he hates having to talk to their leader. Once they arrive, Abel sees the leader of White Brigade, Phelps, already seated, so he gives him a shallow greeting. And now that everyone is here, the guild master informs them that he called them here because he'd like them to investigate the recent strange occurrence in the dungeon. Just recently, a group of new adventurers claimed to have run into a goblin archer on the 5th floor. Abel asks him if he is certain that a goblin archer really appeared so high up, and the guild master says he has already been given irrefutable proof, so the intel is correct. That's why he wants to hire both parties to go investigate the dungeon in order to check for signs of the Great Tidal Bore. It has been 10 years since the last one, so there's a good chance that another tidal bore is going to happen soon, and they need to be prepared. Both parties will be paid 100 gold up front and 200 upon their return, but the goal of this mission is simply to investigate, not to fight, so if they find evidence of the tidal bore, they are to return to the surface immediately and inform him. From there, the guild master will close the double walls around the dungeon until he gets back up from the regional knights. The guild master has already gotten permission from the local lord for it, but he still needs to inspect the dungeon to take any action, so he asks them if they are willing to take the job. Both Abel and Phelps agree on behalf of their parties, so the investigation is set for tomorrow morning. The next day, Rio wakes up early because he plans to go to the city's northern library to learn more about alchemy. Ito tells him the northern library is only accessible to people who are D rank and above, but that won't be a problem for Rio. Although Amon remembers hearing rumors that the forbidden texts in that library are only accessible to B rank or higher, so Rio won't be able to get his hands on those. A little while later, Rio arrives at the northern library, and the book selection here is even larger than that of the southern library. This place is so big that he's probably going to need help finding the books he's after, but people would probably look at him weird if he started talking about demons all of a sudden. But just as Rio is climbing a set of stairs, he happens to run into Sarah, and they are both surprised to see each other here. Meanwhile, over by the dungeon, the members of Crimson Sword and White Brigade have both gathered outside the gates to prepare for the investigation, but just as the guild master is about to open it, Abel stops him because he has a bad feeling about this. He asks Lin to use wind magic to scan the first layer of the dungeon before they go in, and when she does, she finds over 100 monsters posted up right at the entrance, meaning the tidal bore has already begun. The guildmaster declares a state of emergency and issues a request for all available adventurers to head to the dungeon and prepare for battle because they are going to need all the help they can get. Meanwhile, back at the library, Sarah introduces herself to Rio, and she is delighted that she actually got to meet him again. She asks Rio what brings him to the library today, and he is about to tell her he wants to research demons, but he realizes that would sound odd. so instead he says he wants to learn about alchemy. Sarah is intrigued since alchemy is a difficult subject, so Rio tells her his goal is to build a golem one day, although he's not in much of a rush to do so. Building a golem is quite the feat, and unfortunately, as far as Sarah knows, there aren't any books on golem craft here. But she does know where Rio can find some books to get started on his alchemy journey. She even offers to show him around since she knows her way around this library pretty well. Along the way, Sarah asks Rio if he enjoys reading books, and he says he loves them, but he hasn't been around books in ages, so he hasn't had many opportunities to read. Sarah laughs a little because the way Rio said that makes it sound like it has been decades since he last saw a book, which is kind of true, but he doesn't want to explain all that. So he changes the subject and starts talking about how he thinks it's cool that Sarah is an elf. Sarah admits that it's rare to find an elf living in human settlements, so she may be considered a bit strange, but if nothing else, staying in this city led her to meet Rio, so she wouldn't change a thing. While Rio and Sarah continue their leisurely stroll through the library, all the gates to the dungeon are locked down and every available adventurer has been stationed on the walls in anticipation of the incoming threat. Before long, the main dungeon gates burst open and hundreds of goblins come pouring out, so the adventurers begin their attack and fire hundreds of arrows while the mages cast as many fireballs as they can. This is going to be a battle of attrition, so whenever someone gets injured, they are rotated out of the formation so they can be healed to continue the fight. But with so many goblins here, the guild master is starting to get worried that they may not be able to hold them off. Phelps tells all of his party members to make sure they conserve their energy, and Abel reminds Lynn not to use too much magic because they can't risk her running out of mana early on. Unfortunately, they are running low on arrows, so Abel doesn't know how much longer they can hold out. A few moments later, Nils and a few other F-rank adventurers arrive, and they brought every arrow they could get their hands on, so they should be able to hold off the goblins now. But that aside, Nils has a message for Abel from the guild master. So he tells him that once the smaller goblins are taken care of, Crimson Sword and White Brigade are going to have to face the boss once it shows up. A few hours later, pretty much all of the regular goblins have been dealt with, and the boss should be showing up soon. So the guild master gives the signal for Crimson Sword and White Brigade to move forward and attack. They all jump off the wall, and Lynn uses her magic to make sure they land safely. But there are still a few goblins down here, so Abel and Phelps rush ahead to finish them off. They then turn their attention to the large goblin general that just emerged from the dungeon. But to their surprise, it's not just one, it's 3 separate goblin generals. This is bad news since having 3 generals means that there must be a goblin king nearby, so they need to finish this quickly. Abel tells everyone that he and Phelps will handle 1 general each, while Rhea and Sheena can go after the last one. And now that everyone is clear on the plan, they all spring into action. Abel evades one of the goblin's strikes and manages to cut its arm off, so it shouldn't be too hard to take the goblin generals down, but just then, he notices something off inside the dungeon, so he yells for everyone to get down immediately. In the next moment, a wind slash is sent straight at them, slicing all the goblin generals in half, but luckily, everyone else managed to duck in time to avoid getting bisected. The one responsible for the air slash was the Goblin King, and it clearly won't be as easy to defeat as the others, so Abel and Phelps rush in to try and catch it off guard. However, when Phelps tries to pierce it with his spear, it bounces right off the Goblin King's armor. Phelps is forced to pull back since he can't do any damage to it, but Abel isn't slowing down at all. He charges straight at the Goblin King and uses his perfect shadow technique to evade its attack before piercing his chest. That wasn't enough to kill the Goblin King, but Abel never expected to finish it off on his own. He then calls out to Lynn, who has been charging up a wind bullet spell this entire time, and once he's out of the way, she swish cheeses the Goblin King, officially putting an end to the crisis. Everyone heads back to the guild to celebrate their victory, and by the time Rayo returns, he has no idea why everyone is so happy. But while the rest of the guild members get to party, the guild master is buried elbow deep in paperwork because he still needs to send out the reports on the title boar and process all the payouts for the adventurers who helped deal with it. And on top of all that, researchers from the royal capital are bound to show up sooner or later asking to collect data on the title boar, so he's going to have to deal with them too. Meanwhile, at the party, Abel has just finished explaining everything that happened with the title boar while he was in the library when Abel's friends show up. Lynn has been meaning to ask Rio in person for a while now, so she tells him she wants to know if he can really create thick ice walls at a distance. Rio confirms it, and to be exact, he says he can cast spells up to a distance of around 40 meters away, but it took him a long time to get the hang of it, so it's not as easy as he makes it look. Even with that being the case, Lynn has never heard of someone being able to use magic at such a distance, so she asked Rio if it's some kind of original spell, and if so, then she wants to know what incantation he uses to cast it. Rio says he'd be glad to show her later, but as for the incantation, he kind of just makes it up on the spot, so she can use wherever she wants. Just then, Nils points out that most of the food is already gone, so if Rio doesn't hurry, he won't get anything to eat. He excuses himself to go grab some food, but Lin is still confused by what he meant when he said he just goes with the flow for incantations. Abel then informs her that Rio only uses incantations because he thinks they are cool, but he is perfectly capable of casting spells without saying a word, and that sounds even more absurd to her than the ice walls did. Early the next morning, Nils, Ito, and Amon all gather at the guild to look for a job, but they are disappointed to see the job board completely empty. Just then, Rio happens to walk by, and he asks what the three of them are doing since they usually be out working by now. Unfortunately, after the title board yesterday, the dungeon was closed down for inspections, so they won't be able to go there for a while. They were hoping to find a resource-gathering job to get by in the meantime, but with all the items that were dropped during the title board, there isn't much demand for resource gathering. Their problems aside, they ask Rio what he's doing, so he tells them he is actually looking for some magic copper ore because he needs it to begin practicing alchemy. Ito recalls hearing that magic copper ore is super expensive, and Rio tells him he's right since the last store he went to told him it would cost 50 gold pieces for a single copper piece. The money isn't really of much significance to Rio since he's loaded, but he wants to help his friends out, so he asks them if they'd be interested in gathering some magic copper ore for him. He says he's willing to pay them 4 gold coins each regardless of whether they find any copper ore or not, and if they do find some, he will buy it off them for 25 gold coins. All three of them are stunned because that's more money than they've ever made in their lives, but Ito asks Rio if he's really alright with paying them so much. Rio says at the end of the day, if they find the copper, he will only have to pay them 37 gold, which is a lot cheaper than the 50 gold he'd have to pay to get the copper in town. So it's a good deal for him as well. Since they confirm that Rio is serious about the deal, the three of them rush off to begin their search, but once they are gone, Rio hears a commotion outside, so he goes to take a look. Downstairs, he sees Dan arguing with a group of knights who are pretty much trying to kidnap a girl in broad daylight. The girl clearly doesn't want to go with them, so when they try dragging her away, Don steps in and pushes the knight to loosen his grip on the girl. She is now free, but they have bigger issues to worry about because the knights still outnumber Dan 4-1, and they have swords, so there's no way he can win this fight. Knight's group leader prepares to teach Dan a lesson for daring to oppose a knight, but for some reason, as soon as he takes a step, he trips and falls to the ground. Everyone there is really confused since there's clearly nothing near the knight's feet, but the knight doesn't want to accept the embarrassment of admitting that he tripped over his own feet, so he accuses Dan of doing something to him. However, as he is trying to get back to his feet, he trips yet again. Shortly after, Phelps shows up and he is appalled by the actions of these so-called knights. At first, the knights try to threaten him since they technically have more power within the city than adventurers do, but their intimidation tactics don't work on Phelps because while he may be an adventurer, he is also a nobleman. His full name is Phelps Heinlein, and as soon as the knights hear that Phelps is from the Heinlein family, they realize they've messed up. Phelps' father, Alexis Heinlein, was the former Royal Knights captain, meaning the Heinlein family has a lot of authority over the knights, and Phelps could probably get them fired on a whim if he wanted to. And if he were around while they were trying to kidnap the girl, he probably wouldn't think twice about ending them, but right now, all he knows is that they were about to gang up on Dan, so he yells at them for being a disgrace to knighthood and says they should get lost before he changes his mind about letting them go. Once the knights are gone, Phelps looks up at Rio because he notices what he did earlier. He had already heard that Rio's magic was extraordinary from Abel, but seeing it for himself was still amazing because he has never witnessed anyone use magic at such a distance or with such accuracy. Of course, he doesn't plan to tell anyone that Rio was the one who made those royal knights slip since that would be a hassle for Rio to deal with, but he really appreciates Rio stepping in to help because he feels personally responsible for letting such rotten people become royal knights. Later that night, Rio is having lunch at the tavern when Abel happens to show up. It's rare for him to be out without the rest of his party, so Rio immediately assumes that Abel must be going to the red light district after this. Abel panics and tells Rio to stop talking before people overhear him, and with Rio's expert deductive skills, he surmises that since Abel doesn't want people thinking he's the kind of person to go to the pleasure district, he must have his eyes on someone. At first he thought it might be Lin, but Abel tells him he's wrong because Lin already has a crush on Warren. With that being the case, Rio concludes that Abel must have a crush on Ria, and gets even more panicked trying to deny it, but that pretty much confirms Rio's suspicion. Abel's crush aside, Rio asks him what he's really doing out by himself tonight, and technically he is going to the pleasure district, but not for the usual reasons, and since Rio is here, he could really use his help. One of the dungeon investigators who was dispatched to Loon is an old friend of Abel's, and he was assigned royal knights to act as his guards while he's in town. Unfortunately, those guards are the same ones who Rio spotted earlier, and there have been many reports of them committing heinous crimes using their positions as knights. Abel heard that they were in the pleasure district tonight, and they are bound to cause trouble at some point, so he wants to stop them before anyone gets hurt. As they are walking, Rio happens to notice two adventurers talking, but he has met every single adventurer in town by this point, and he doesn't recognize those two. Abel tells him that it's not uncommon for adventurers to travel to Loon to explore the dungeon, but the dungeon is closed right now, so it does seem suspicious, especially since the adventurers are dressed in all black and walk away as soon as they realize Rio and Abel are watching them. A little while later, Rio and Abel intentionally walk down a dark alley, and within moments they are ambushed by those shady adventurers. But Rio already saw this coming, so he knocks all of them out by dropping ice on their heads. To be honest, that was a lot easier than he thought it would be, but they still don't know what these guys were up to, so they are going to have to hand them over to the guards for interrogation. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Pleasure District, Phelps is walking by himself when those knights sneak up behind him. Their leader still feels embarrassed about Phelps getting in his way earlier, so he and the others plan to kill him tonight. But just as they are about to draw their swords, they all realize they can't move for some reason. You see, this whole thing was a trap orchestrated by Phelps, because he is now aware of how sinister this group of knights truly is, and he would be a failure of a noble if he let them continue as things are, so he had Shenna hit them with paralytic needles. And with them stuck in place, he calls upon her fire magic, reducing their bodies to ash until not a trace remains. The next morning, the research team from the capital arrives in town, and just as the guild master had predicted, they immediately cause trouble for everyone by claiming today's entire food provision for their investigation. On top of that, Clive is also demanding that Hugh reopen the dungeon and give him some adventurers for protection while they investigate. Hugh tells Clive he is being unreasonable because they don't know what state the dungeon is in right now, and it could be really dangerous, but Clive reminds him that he has been given full authority over the investigation, so Hugh has to do whatever he tells him. The advisor, Arthur, apologizes to Hugh for Clive's behavior and promises to replace the supplies that were taken from the town, which Hugh greatly appreciates, but Clive still refuses to give up reopening the dungeon to go in. Hugh eventually concedes and says he is willing to open the dungeon for Clive, but he makes it clear that if anything goes wrong, neither Hugh nor the city of Loon will be held responsible. It will all fall on Clive's shoulders. He is starting to have second thoughts now that he realizes he will have to face the consequences if anything goes wrong, but he can't back down now after how much he has argued over this. He eventually agrees to Hugh's terms, but there's still a matter of finding adventurers to accompany the research team. A little while later, Rio is heading to the cafeteria when a girl comes running out and asks him if he can show her the way to the Adventurers Guild. Rio is on his way to get lunch, but since she needs help, he takes her to the guild. The girl's name is Natalie Schwarzkopf, and she's here to deliver a letter requesting the aid of Abel's party in defending the investigation team in the dungeon. Rio is surprised to hear that an investigation team is being sent down there since the dungeon is closed, but Abel is sure someone must have pulled some strings to force Hugh to reopen it. The reason the dungeon was closed in the first place was because decades ago, after a tidal bore, an A-rank party was sent down to investigate, but none of them ever returned. Even her leader, who was practically an S-rank superhuman, was never seen again, and if whatever was down there was enough to take out an S-rank, the guild didn't want to take any chances. So from then on, it became policy to close down the dungeon whenever a tidal bore occurs. Rio is intrigued by the story, but he is also pretty hungry, so he's going to have to go now. Once Rio is gone, Lynn asks if Natalie is really part of the Schwarzkopf family, since they are renowned for their legendary water magic. Natalie confirms it, so Lynn asks her if she has ever heard of magic that allows a mage to create an ice wall at a distance. Natalie says she's not sure something like that is even possible, so Abel tells her that as hard as it may be to believe, Rio is actually capable of creating an ice wall 40 meters away, and on that note, he wants to warn everyone here that under no circumstances are they to pick a fight with Rio. And if they do find themselves up against him, they should just give up and surrender because there's no way they'd be able to beat him even if they all fought him at once. He also tells Natalie that if she ever needs help and she can't find any of them, then she should go to Rio for help. 3 days go by and Rio's friends finally get back from their mission, and they manage to gather 2 magic copper ores, so Rio pays them 90 gold coins in total, and they are really thankful because they won't have to work for a while with this much money. Meanwhile, down in the dungeon, the investigation team has already made it all the way to the 7th floor, but strangely, they haven't seen a single monster yet, so they continue heading deeper. Eventually, they happen to stumble upon a black square in the side of the wall, and none of them have any idea what it is since they've never seen anything like it before, but Clive is ecstatic since this is a prime anomaly for analysis. He immediately orders everyone to set up the measuring equipment so they can send data back up to the surface, and once they do, the analysis team, including Nathalie, will begin scrutinizing the data to identify the anomaly. However, as soon as Clive's research team sticks the mana density gauge through the gate, everyone there is instantly teleported away, and the surface team loses contact with them. This was the end of episode 6. Subscribe to not miss the next part.